Hey everyone, Mike here, owner of 4372. Today I'm going to be starting to dig into my valley of death. The reason I'm doing this is because I can see a little bit of liquid towards the front of the engine, kind of towards this side, in that little gap of the valley that you can see. So I thought I would make a complete video guide to how to remove the intake to get into the valley. To do this, I'm going to be following the guide that circulates around the internet, around Facebook and DMC Talk. I thought that I would just add to this great guide by providing video references of all the steps in there as well. I know for somebody new to this like me, could really use visual references and some more kind of different angles and things like that. So I'm going to try my best to do that while following the guide, and hopefully that will help other people as well. Now here are some various tools that you might need to do this job. I have a 3/8 inch drive ratchet and socket set here. I have a 1/2 inch drive set here. I've got my T Allen keys that will assist with some of the cap screws that we will encounter. You also want to go ahead and get yourself some new gaskets, some of these new seals and things like that that you will want to replace. I also went ahead and ordered bolts to replace as well, because I don't know how old some of those bolts are in my car. You'll also just want some sandwich bags and some tape. The sandwich bags will be good for collecting all the old bolts and some of those old seals and things and keeping everything organized. And the tape will be useful for labeling anything, because you do want to go through and try to keep track of your work best you can. Now there are several different jobs that you can do while you're in your valley, not just checking out for coolant leaks, but it also gives you easy access to your slave cylinder if you have a manual transmission DeLorean. You can also get easier access to some of the hoses and things that run down in the valley, including some of those vacuum hoses. You also get easy access to your water pump here. So if you have anything going on with that, it makes it a lot easier to take that out and to do that replacement as well. You also get easy access to some of your fuel injectors, which tend to run in these little valleys back here along the side of the engine. And you can also check out these spark plugs and spark plug wires, as you will have access to your distributor there in the back much easier. A couple other things that will be useful too for this job is, of course, having some easy to access printed out versions of that guide too, which I will be following and I'll be making notes on and highlighting and things like that. I've also printed out a diagram I found online of the fuel hose routing that somebody made, and it just makes it really easy to label and remember later how your fuel hoses were routed and where those should connect. Now, before you start this process, you do want to disconnect or remove your battery. That will increase the safety of this job, of course. You don't want to run into anything and short circuit something or possibly shock yourself. I just went ahead and took my battery completely out and set it far away from the car to reduce any kind of chance at all at anything happening. Okay, so the first step here to getting into your valley and removing your intake is actually getting your air filter box off. That is very easy with these 3 screws right here. Now my car has these wing nuts on there, so it makes it really easy for me to do this by hand. But if you still have these stock bolts on there, you will need a 10mm socket to remove those. Okay, next you want to remove the hose here that runs out of your air filter box. All right, now that you have your hose disconnected and after some finagling, you can remove your air filter box. This is the view once you have removed your air filter box. I think we're all familiar with this, even some of the other new owners out there. You've probably done this at least once, just to change out your air filter or just to check things out as you're inspecting your car. And so over the course of this video and this guide, we'll be removing this guy and all this stuff here. So this will be fun. Now it's at this point where I started labeling things so that I can reference back to the cylinders in the fuel hose routing guide here. So I labeled them according to what it says here. So the muffler is back here and the cylinders are labeled just like this. So you can see that on my tape here, that I've labeled those according to the guide. And I'm just gonna label things along the way that I will need to reattach later and that I don't want to lose track of where they go. It looks like the vacuum hoses are labeled, and there are diagrams, of course, on the car and around the internet for how to reattach those, so I'm not too worried about those, but I do want to make sure that I get my fuel hoses correctly attached so that the car will run later when I put it all back together. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my plunger here and put this in a plastic bag for safekeeping, because this could easily get knocked and kind of get lost somewhere while I'm working, so I definitely don't want to lose this. I also started to bag up my bolts, so you can see my air filter box here, along with one of my Ziploc bags with the bolts that will hold that in. And so I'm going to try and keep everything organized along my little cardboard runway here so that I can keep myself as organized as possible. Okay, the next step here is to cut the zip ties that are holding these three vacuum hoses that are coming out of the driver's side of the pontoon here. Okay, the next step is to disconnect this white connector here. Okay, now that that is apart, we'll have to loosen up the harness here by getting it out of these little clips that are kind of holding it in place on the engine. Okay, next we're going to be removing the idle speed motor, which is this guy right here. So there's going to be a couple of connections here. It's held on by this cap screw right here. The instructions say that you should remove the hose clamp to start this process. So you're going to be removing this hose clamp that's right behind there. You're going to need a flathead screwdriver to do that. And then you'll be disconnecting the electrical connector from the idle speed motor. Okay, I've loosened that hose clamp. So now we'll just disconnect the connector off the top. Okay, next we're going to remove the two cap screws that are holding the idle speed motor to the bracket. Now the instructions say that you don't need to necessarily remove the bracket itself, which is held on by this. So I'm not going to do that unless I need to, but I will be removing this screw right here and the other one right down there that is holding the motor to the bracket. Okay, now that you have the two cap screws disconnected, the idle speed motor will be able to separate from the bracket here, which will allow you to separate it from the cold start valve, like I've done here. And so now I'm just working on sliding it out of the engine with the copper pipe right down here, the pipe of agony as we like to call it. I'll be pulling that out as well. Okay, I've just completed step 3 by removing my idle speed motor. I did have to separate the idle speed motor from the pipe of agony in order to get the motor itself out, and then I took the pipe out afterward, and then I just reassembled them here on my cardboard so that I know how they're supposed to be connected and all that, and just to keep it all together. But that's what made it easier for me. Okay, the next step is to unplug electrical connections. We'll be disconnecting the electrical connection to the cold start valve, it's right here, the blue one, and then the warm-up regulator back here, which is the gray one. So we'll just go ahead and do that right now. Okay, everything looks good on the warm-up regulator. Now we're moving on to step 5. That is going to be removing this W pipe right here. There are 5 bolts keeping this onto the intake. You're gonna see bolt 1, 2, 3 is right there in the middle, 4, and 5. And that is an 11mm socket to remove those. Okay, I've got all 5 bolts out of the W pipe. The middle one is much longer than the other 4 that were on the sides. So I just went ahead and marked that. I will be replacing these bolts, so I just wanted to make sure that I kept track of the positioning of the longer bolt. Okay, now that we have the bolts removed, it is at this point that we can remove the W pipe from the intake manifold. You may have to tug a little bit at this. I kind of pried mine free already, but I was able to do it by hand. And there it is. Now you do want to note these 2 paper gaskets. There are gaskets on either side. There are also O-rings right here. It looks like I just have the black O-rings. I believe I'm supposed to have some plastic rings there too, but I will look into that and link that in the description. Okay, so it is at this point that you have 2 gaping holes that lead straight into the engine. So I'm going to take some paper towels or some rags and plug those holes. You definitely don't want to drop anything in there. You don't want to continue your work while these are still exposed, just to reduce any risk of dropping anything into the engine and possibly ruining your entire day. Okay, we're now at the step where we're going to be disconnecting our fuel hoses from our fuel distributor. This will start to loosen up the fuel mixture unit so that we can start to get that out from on top of the intake. The order in which you do this doesn't matter. I went ahead and labeled the hoses, at least the ones that go to the 6 cylinders, just so that I know which ones go where later on. I will be labeling hoses as I move along too. And to do this, you will need a 12mm socket, a 17mm socket, and a 19mm socket. The 12mm will be these top bolts here, some of these smaller ones, and then the bigger ones will be along the side there. Now, as you're doing this, you do want to be careful. Some of these may have some gas that will leak out or spray out, just kind of depending on how recently you've started your car and how much pressure is in the system. So as I do this, I like to try and stuff a paper towel right under here to kind of catch anything that starts leaking as I loosen the bolts. Just a quick progress shot on how I'm organizing things. I'm kind of just going from left to right as I go through the steps here, and I'm trying to keep my bags of bolts with the actual parts that they're associated with. That's probably a no-brainer, but this is just how I'm doing it. Let me know if you did it differently or if there's a better way that I could do this. Okay, so I have disconnected all of the fuel lines from my fuel distributor. You can see I still have them labeled here. I did decide to zip tie these together loosely just to help keep them bundled together and keep the area nice and clean. The next step is going to be removing other connections from the fuel mixture assembly. So there are a couple things here that we're going to disconnect. There's a vacuum line down there and some connections towards the back that we are now going to remove. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is disconnect these two wires from the microswitch. Now this black one was the one that was further down on the bottom. This one with the green stripe was the upper one. It was a little bit tricky getting to this black one that was further down. So I was able to kind of get like a finger from this side and from above to kind of get a little bit of leverage. But what helped me was using some long nose pliers to gently grip it and then just kind of give it a little tug, and it was able to pop right out without any issues. Okay, next we're going to disconnect this vacuum line. You can kind of see that connected right there, kind of right there, back there. So we want to disconnect that vacuum line next. Okay, next we're going to remove the little clip that holds the throttle arm to the throttle spool. So that's going to be on the underside of the spool. And you can see this little connection here, and the clip is this little piece of wire here, and it's going to rotate around and slide out around this little cable. Okay, in order to remove this clip, you will have to rotate it. I believe it's going to be clockwise to sort of unhinge it from the other side that's on this side. You'll kind of unhinge it a little bit, and it's going to rotate this way, and then it's going to slide straight out just like that, and you'll be able to remove the clip. Okay, once you get that clip off there, you're going to remove this throttle arm. Now, I've already kind of loosened mine a little bit, but I used some leverage with the screwdriver here to help me. But you do want to be careful. You don't want to break anything. But this is going to come right off of there, just like that. Okay, now that we've disconnected the throttle arm from the spool, we're going to remove this bolt. And then there are two right there. Those are holding on to this whole assembly, the whole bracket and everything. So once you remove those bolts, you'll be able to kind of slide this throttle spool over. We're not going to be taking it out of the car, but you do want it kind of out of the way so that we can get the intake out of here when we get there. Okay, we're going to remove this top bolt first. Okay, got this top bolt loosened. Now the second one is a little bit harder to access because of this fuel injector right here. So I went ahead and grabbed a 7/16 wrench to kind of get in there and get in that space, and this seems to work pretty well. I think in millimeters this is going to be an 11 millimeter wrench if you have that. But this seems to work pretty well, so we're just going to continue loosening these and get those removed. Now these bolts do have washers on them, so you do want to keep an eye on those as you're working on these and pulling them out. Okay, I've set my throttle spool assembly aside a little bit, so you can kind of see how I have this positioned. This is the little arm that we disconnected beforehand. and it'll just rest nicely on this side. Just be careful that you don't hook this on anything as you're moving that, so just be mindful of that it's connected to this thing right here, so just be careful. Okay, the next thing is to disconnect the connections on the solenoid behind the fuel distributor. So that is going to be right back here. So this guy, you want to disconnect this electrical connection and these two vacuum lines. Right, they are now disconnected. I'm going to label those vacuum lines so that I know which one was facing the front end of the car and which one was facing the rear end of the car. All right, we've made a lot of progress. So the only things remaining to remove the fuel mixture unit here are going to be these cap screws right here. These are kind of mounting it in onto the intake. And there's also a ground wire right back here that we're going to need to disconnect. Once we disconnect those, then the fuel mixture unit will be completely disconnected and loose, and we will be able to remove it from the car. In order to remove those two cap screws and that ground wire, you'll need a 5mm Allen wrench for these cap screws, and then a 10mm socket for the ground wire bolt. Okay, now the two screws are removed, so we'll just move on to the ground wire on the side. I'm going to unclip this vacuum line just to kind of get it out of the way a little bit. There's a couple of pieces that came off here that go together like that, and they hold the vacuum lines in place. The ground wire is removed. I think I'm going to go ahead and reinstall these pieces on here, just to try and keep everything together. The ground wire is now off. All right, the fuel mixture unit is out of the car. It was fairly easy. All I had to do was just set aside this harness just a little bit, and I was supporting it by the fuel distributor unit and lifting it up like this, while supporting the front end there with my other hand, and I was able to just kind of lift it straight out of the car. Make sure as you're doing that you just kind of watch for these connections, especially watch for these guys. You don't want those getting hung up on the microswitch and getting damaged. But fairly simple process, and we are now one step closer to getting into the valley of the car. All right, we're on to step 9 of getting into our valley and removing our intake. So this next step, we're going to be removing the cold start valve, which is this right here. And it has a little pipe that runs across and connects to the intake right here. So what we're going to be doing is removing this bolt. That is a 10mm. We're going to end up removing these vacuum lines right here, these two vacuum lines. So we'll need a flat head to loosen those hose clamps. And then we'll just need to unclip the spark plug wires from the little clips right there. And the whole unit should just slide right out. clipping the spark plug wires. Okay. All right, the cold start valve is now loose. Now I just gotta wiggle its way out of here. Okay, now the cold start valve is out of the car. Quick note, there was an O-ring right here. Looked like mine was a little bit old, so I'm going to be replacing that O-ring. Also, my cold start valve was kind of routed under this fuel injector, this fuel line here. So I did have to lift up the line a little bit to kind of squeeze it through to get it out of the car. Okay, now we're on to step 10, where we're going to start disconnecting the connections that go to the intake manifold. A couple of those connections are these vacuum lines. This one with a clamp on there, so you're going to want to loosen up that hose clamp and remove that line. We also want to remove this vacuum line right here. This does not have a hose clamp. And then I also want to disconnect these connections right here. I think there's a ground connection here that is on the idle speed motor bracket. And I think once we disconnect those, we'll be able to unbolt the intake and remove it from the car. Okay, now that we've disconnected all of the remaining connections that go to the intake, we can start to remove the bolts that bolt the intake to the engine. So you can see I've disconnected these ground wires from this cap screw right here. And then we've also disconnected the vacuum lines that were going to the rear of the intake. These 4 bolts that we're going to have to remove, the first one is right there. The second one is right back here. The third is going to be right there. And then the fourth is going to be tucked away just right here. To remove those 4 bolts, we will need an 11mm socket. You may need to use an extension as well to get to some of these deeper ones. So you'll just have to play around a little bit with how to reach those. Okay, that is all 4 bolts out of the intake that were holding it to the engine. I was able to use this socket with an extension for all 4 bolts. This one over here was at a bit of an angle, but I was able to kind of get this in there to at least break the bolt loose, and then continue to loosen it, and then I just had to finger loosen towards the end there. Another tip is watch out for all the washers that are on each of those. You certainly don't want to lose one of those, and then when you pull the intake off, have one of them inadvertently fall into the engine or anything like that. So just keep an eye on those, make sure you get those washers out with the bolts, and that's it. We will be moving on to the next step, which is removing the intake. Now that we have the intake off, we have access to the valley and the Y pipe, the water return pipe here. We've got our spark plugs, our cap and rotor. We have our slave cylinder back here that we can now access a little bit more easily. We can access the thermostat housing and the water pump much more easily now, so if you need to do a job there, you can do that. For now, I am going through and plugging up all of the holes so that we don't accidentally drop anything in there. And that is how you take your intake off. All right, we've got the intake off. I have all of the holes plugged here with paper towels, so the engine is protected. Now this is why I wanted to come in here to my valley. You can see I have some fluid kind of running along there. So the next step for me is to figure out what's going on, where that fluid is coming from. I may end up having to remove this Y pipe, so if I do end up having to do that, I will make a video for that. But yeah, that's where we are. All right, y'all, here's my final layout as I kind of took everything out of the car and bagged up all my bolts and things like that. So you can see kind of going from left to right, I have my air filter stuff, my idle speed motor stuff together, have the W pipe, got my fuel mixture unit with the banjo bolts and other associated bolts and things that came off of that. Have my cold start valve here. I have my intake manifold bolts here and the intake manifold right there. Now that we've done all of our work and our projects in the valley, it's time to start reassembling the valley. First, we're going to put the intake manifold back on, and then all of the other components after that. The work I did for this car was changing out all of my vacuum lines that are connected there. Also went through and replaced a lot of the cooling system components and hoses and things like that that are a little hard to get to with the intake manifold back on. So let's get started. To start prepping to put the intake manifold back on, I've done a few things here. I've connected my vacuum lines and made sure that they are super tight and connected here. I've also reconnected the electrical connections here. I've also gone through and replaced the O-ring seals on each of the cylinder holes. So those are also ready to go. The intake manifold is going to bolt on to holes here, right there, right here, and right here. So we're going to be aiming for those bolt holes once we get the intake manifold under the wiring harness and lined up. And that's it for placing the intake manifold. As you saw, I did have to kind of finagle it around the wiring harness a little bit and just kind of do some maneuvering to get it into place. So what I'm going to do next is just double check that my O-ring seals are still in place, and then we can bolt it onto the engine. Okay, so what I'm doing now is just going around the edges here and just checking to make sure that I don't have any lines pinched, that none of my fuel lines are kind of moved out of place, none of my spark plug wires are in the way of anything. So far it's looking good. Everything is cleared. I also want to double check that my bolt holes are aligned, and it looks like my placement is good here too. So we're ready to start putting the bolts into the holes there. And the way that my car is designed, I have a later style car, so my wiring harness is going to drape on about this side of the intake, and it's going to be on the driver's side, so I'll be putting things in from this side to build my valley back up. All right, what I'm doing next is now just loosely placing my bolts into the bolt holes. You want to make sure that your bolts are covered in some kind of anti-seize. Since I ordered these stainless bolts from Delorean Go, I am using copper anti-seize and plenty of it to prevent issues with that later. Okay, I have finger tightened all 4 M7 bolts into place, showing that the bolt holes are aligned and that my intake manifold is in the right spot. I'm now going to torque these down to 9 foot-pounds. As I'm torquing these down, I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern so that it tightens down evenly. And that's it. Our 4 bolts are now all torqued down to 9 foot-pounds. Okay, next thing we have to do is to complete the connections on the back of the intake manifold. So we have a vacuum connection right here that we have to reconnect. We have another vacuum connection right here that we have to reconnect, and that is this black vacuum hose right here. And then there's a ground that will bolt right here that will connect to the little bolt right there on the side. Okay, those are the 2 vacuum hose connections. Okay, next we're going to attach the little ground wire. That bolt comes off with a 10mm socket. You gotta be careful, you don't want to drop anything back into the valley after you've gone through all of this work so far. Okay, now you can see that ground wire is connected to the ground point. That's what that looks like. And you want to make sure that the bracket here and that are holding the clips for the various wires is pointing in this direction as well, so that you can clip your wires into that. And those are all the connections for the intake manifold. All right, first thing we're going to do to start installing our cold start valve is to install this new rubber O-ring. Okay, the next thing we want to do is slide the cold start valve through this side of the intake so that it comes through that gap there, and you want to align it onto the O-ring so we can bolt it down to the intake. All right, I've just gotten the bolt in to hold my cold start valve down. I've looped it up with anti-seize to make sure it's easier to take apart later if we needed to. And to torque this down, you're going to use a 10mm socket. After you've installed your cold start valve, you want to make the other auxiliary attachments to it. It does have 2 vacuum lines that attach right here. The one on the top comes from the oil filler tube right there, and the one on the bottom comes from the truck canister. It is this middle connection, and it runs all the way over to the bottom of the cold start valve. And you also want to install the electrical plug here so that you actually get power and functionality of this. And that's everything for the cold start valve. All right, now that we have our cold start valve installed, we're gonna need to put in our air fuel mixture as the next step here. In order to prep for that, what you want to do is just make sure that there aren't any connections back here or any wiring or vacuum lines that are going to be in the way back here. I've already kind of gone through and just made sure that everything's out of the way. I have my wiring harness kind of set to the side and over here so that I can kind of tuck the unit under the wiring harness where it needs to go. One thing you do want to watch out for is the little arm on the front of this as you're sliding it in. So I'm going to try and actually tilt the unit downward and kind of get this end of it under the wiring harness first, so that it'll slide right through here and have that arm ready to attach here to the throttle spool. There will be a couple of connections that we will need to make once we get the air fuel mixture unit installed here. It's going to be mounted by 2 cap screws right here and right here on the intake. And then once those are secured down, then we can start to reattach all of our fuel lines. There is a vacuum line here that we'll need to attach to the kind of the bottom front of it there. And then we'll also have to attach the arm to the throttle spool here. So there will be a few connections, and I will show each of those as I make them. Okay, I have the air fuel mixture here. I'm going to tuck the little arm under the harness. Just being careful where that is going. And I'm going to tuck the unit under the wiring harness. Tilt it downward a little bit. And place it where it's going to mount to the intake. And now it's in place. So right now the air fuel mixture unit is not bolted down or mounted, it is just loosely sitting in its place in the intake. But you can see how the brackets line up to those bolt holes. And you can see how I've worked the arm into position here. That will end up connecting to the bottom of the spool here. So we will work through that once we get there. But the next step is to start making our connections. Okay, the first connection we want to make that's going to be made a lot easier while this unit isn't bolted down or anything like that is to make the connection with the fuel or with the vacuum line that connects kind of under the unit. You can see that little nipple right there. That's where that vacuum line is going to connect. And it is the smaller vacuum line running out from the canisters there in the side. So I'm going to try and kind of lift this up a little bit so I can have a little bit more room to connect this vacuum line under there. Okay, now I have that vacuum line securely connected to the unit. So the next thing I'm going to do is just loosely put in the 2 mounting bolts here, just to have those in place and just kind of help this keep from moving around too much as we start to make the other connections on the K-jet unit and the vacuum solenoid towards the rear. Got the first screw in there. I'm just going to put in the second screw. You want to be very careful while you're doing this. You don't want to drop any of your washers or lose anything down in the valley while you're doing this, since you've just reassembled that. Okay, I have those loosely in there. I have not torqued these down yet, so I just have a little bit of play while we work on making the other connections. Okay, the next thing we're gonna do is reconnect the black connector and the 2 vacuum lines to this solenoid here. I do have these labeled from when I disassembled so that I could do this a lot easier. You can see the black connector here. It's 2-prong. And then I have a blue vacuum line kind of attached to it that I labeled as towards the front of the car. So that will be the middle slot right there. And then there's a shorter vacuum line that we need to connect. That will be the one right there closest to the unit. All right, here are the connections. That is what that is supposed to look like when you are done putting those on. In order to start connecting the fuel lines back to the K-Jet unit, I think what I want to do is to connect all the lines that are on the sides here first. Get those in there before putting the top connections on so that I have enough room and access to get them in there and torque them down and all of that stuff without these lines on the top getting in the way. So I think the first one I'm going to do is going to be right here, which is the fuel pump line. And then next, I'm going to tackle these connections here, and then this connection right here last. And we'll just do them one by one. Okay, here's what the fuel line looks like installed. I have not torqued this down yet. I still want to have a little bit of play and flexibility for this to move around just a tiny bit as I work on the other lines, just in case I need to shift this around a little bit. But see, you can see the copper washers on either side of the line here as it's installed. These will help seal the line when you torque it down. Okay, the next fuel line we're going to do is going to be this line right here. This is a smaller banjo bolt, and this is going to be for the line that's running off of your frequency valve. Off the end here, the long side is going to curve around here, and mine will be attaching something like that right there to the K-Jet unit. And the reason why I'm going to do this one next is because right here in the middle of these three connections is a pretty big connection where these two lines are going to be connected. So if I did these first, they would kind of get in the way of this connection right here. So I'm just trying to be mindful of the order so that I have room and the ability to connect these lines with as minimal obstructions as possible. Okay, here's what the frequency valve line looks like installed there. Again, I've not torqued this down, so I have some flex room to move that line around as I make the other connections. Next, I'm going to be attaching these two. These are connected together on the same banjo bolt in this middle connection right here. So I have to find a way for these lines to come through and have enough room to stick together with this line and this line around it. So I'll be working that out here for my car and figuring out how those are going to fit. The banjo bolt for these next two lines looks just like this. It's another M12 banjo bolt, but this one has two holes in it for the two lines that will be attached to it. You'll also need 3 copper washers for this one. One to go near the head of the bolt, washer to go in between the lines, and then a washer to go in between the line and the K-Jet unit itself. So you will need 3 M12 copper washers for these next two lines. Okay, here's what these two lines look like connected. You can see which way the lines are running behind these other fuel lines, and you can see the 3 copper washers in between each connection here to help prevent any leaks. And then you can see I also have some room to kind of flex these lines to torque this down when I need to. So I have not torqued this bolt down just yet. Still leaving these with a little bit of flexibility for later. Okay, the next line we're going to be connecting is this connection right here. This will be another M8 banjo bolt connection. This fuel line right here will be connecting right there over the other lines I've done. This line is coming from your warm-up regulator, and it's coming from this connection right here. So if you're kind of facing it from the rear of your car, it's the one that's closest to you. So this line right here is going to be connecting all the way around, back behind or in front of K-Jet to this connection right here. And again, this is an M8 banjo bolt. Okay, here's what it looks like with this line from the warm-up regulator connected. So we are now done with this side of K-Jet. We just have one more connection on this side before we're done with all of the lower connections, and then we can move on to the top connections here. This line right here is going to be coming from your cold start valve right here. It's a very short fuel line, and it'll just route directly to that side connection there. This is also an M8 connection, so you'll just need another M8 banjo bolt and 2 copper washers. Okay, there we go. We have the cold start valve fuel line connected right there on the side, 2 copper washers. Again, I have not torqued any of these just yet because I'm still trying to give myself some flexibility as I install these other lines, but there we go. Okay, now I'll be starting on the top fuel lines to my K-Jet unit. These lines all go to the cylinders. So if you don't know already, the cylinders on the Delorean, these facing from this direction of the engine bay, we have connection 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6. And I labeled these as I was disassembling at the beginning of the project, so I know exactly which lines go where, so that I get my fuel where it needs to go. Okay, number 1 is connected. That's what it should look like when you're done. And we'll just continue doing the other connections just like that. Okay, now I have all of the top connections installed. I have not torqued these down just yet. That will be the next step. But I just wanted to quickly show just kind of what my setup looks like with my fuel lines on my K-Jet, and just kind of generally where my lines are routing. Some people have this line coming from a different direction, but for my car, it seems to work really well coming from this way. But this top line is coming from the bigger connection on the warm-up regulator. So that connects to the center connection right there. And of course, the rest of these on the side all go to the cylinders, which I was able to follow the numbering on my labels from when I disassembled. But this is what it looks like. So now we will be going around and torquing down all the bolts and sailing up all of the connections. For torquing down all of these fuel lines, there is a reference in the workshop manual, but the values for these are pretty straightforward. We have 2 different sizes on here. We have the M12 connections, which is this one right here, and then the one for the fuel filter. And then the rest of them are all M8s. So there's only 2 sets of torque values you need to remember for the K-Jet connections. All of the M8s are going to be torqued down to 7 to 9 foot-pounds, and the M12s are going to be torqued down to 14 to 17 foot-pounds. I wanted to quickly interject. This is not true for all cars, but my car has this ground right here actually attached to this side of the intake. So while I'm up here kind of in between torquing my fuel lines, I'm going to go ahead and just attach this so that once these are torqued down and kind of more stiff, I don't need to move anything out of the way. This is already taken care of. But this ground may be on your driver's side valve cover bolted down somewhere. So as you're putting your valley back together, if you took this ground off from somewhere, make sure you put it back to where it was located originally. Okay, now that I've torqued down the bigger banjo bolts here, I'm going to move on to the smaller connections. Each of these takes a 12mm socket, and these will be torqued down to 7 to 9 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and start with the ones on the sides here so that I have good access to those while these top ones are loose, so I can move those around easily if I need to get better access. Next, I'm going to torque down the connections on the top. I'm gonna leave the center one for last so that once this one is torqued down, I can kind of maneuver this line into place where I need to, and then torque that bolt down. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do that so easily. That is all of the fuel lines torqued down. Okay, next I'm going to torque down the 2 cap screws that are holding the air fuel mixture unit in place here. Now that all of these are torqued down, I feel more comfortable now going ahead and torquing these down, since from here I won't really need to adjust or move anything else around. I don't have any specific torque values for these, but I'm not going to torque these super tight because this is going straight into the intake, which is made of aluminum, which is very soft. So I'm just going to tighten these down just kind of lightly by feel. I'm not going to pull super hard on these or anything like that, because once these are tight enough and all the other connections are put together, this thing is not going anywhere. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. Now, if I do find torque values for these, I will add those to the video or to the description. But for now, these are fairly tight just by feel, and they should hold it in there just fine. Okay, now that we have all our fuel lines torqued down, the next step is to reconnect our micro switch connections. When you disassembled, you should have it labeled. I have mine labeled here, which one is the connection for the top and which one goes on the bottom. Okay, and here's what it looks like with those connections made. You want the black wire towards the bottom and the green wire up top, closest to you. Okay, the next step is going to be reattaching our throttle spool assembly to the intake. This is held on by 3 bolts. There are 2 M7 bolts here towards the side that this is going to bolt to, and then there's a bolt on the top of the thermostat housing. These are all M7 bolts, and then once we kind of reattach the bracket to the intake, then we'll just have to reconnect the arm down here by snapping it back on and putting the clip back in place. So the first thing we're going to do is put the side bolts back in here, and then we'll do the top bolt. Here we're going to put in the 2 side bolts now. One thing I want to note is that I'm making a good habit of putting anti-seize on bolts as I reinstall them, so that in the future I'm not running into any issues of getting bolts out again and snapping. Right now all I'm doing is just finger tightening these so that I can get all the bolts in place, and then I'm going to go through and torque them down afterward. Here's what it's looking like so far. See the 2 bolts right down in here. Got a little bit of room to reach with my fingers, but not a whole lot, so I may have to get a socket with an extension here in a minute. Okay, now I'm going to finger tighten the top bolt to the thermostat housing. Again, I've put just a little bit of anti-seize on that. Alright, and those are all the bolts. Okay, now I've got my socket to start tightening down these just a little bit more. For the bottom bolt that's on the side, I did have to get a universal joint here to allow some better access there to reach that. So I'm using that right now just to get to that bolt and tighten that down. I may not be able to accurately torque that one down, but I'm just going to try and get it tightened as much as I can, and then I'll torque down the thermostat housing bolt and the top side bolt, and those should hold the assembly in place pretty well. Okay, now I'm going to be torquing down the top side bolt and the thermostat housing bolt. These are M7 bolts. They're not going to require a very high torque setting. I have my digital torque wrench set to 7 foot-pounds, so I'm keeping it fairly light. You could probably do this by feel too if you have some experience, but you really don't want to put that much torque on these since they are going into some soft aluminum parts. That's 7 foot-pounds on the top. All right, for the side one, I needed to put an extension on so that I could have better reach and fit my digital torque wrench on there. But it is still the same size as the top one. I'm using an 11mm socket. And that's it. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is reattach the arm here to the bottom of the spool assembly. Just to show you the location, it is right below. We just want to snap this back onto the ball. Just like that. And then we're going to reinstall the clip so that it secures it into place. All right, here's a close-up of the clip. You can see that I got it started. And then you're just going to rotate the clip into place. Just like that. And that will keep those connections together. And that's all it is. Okay, now we have the throttle spool assembly completely bolted on and hooked up and put together. So the next step is to reattach our W pipe. And if you remember, the W pipe goes on the front of the intake just like that. I took off the old seals. There are going to be 2 rings on each side here, on each of these openings. I ordered a new set from Delorean Go. It comes with the 2 plastic white rings and the 2 silicone black rings. The white rings are going to go on first, and then the black rings will go on top of those white rings. But yeah, you definitely want to get some new seals on there before reinstalling this so that you don't have any leaks. I also ordered a pair of the paper gaskets that go on these mating surfaces as well. That will also help seal all of the connections to the intake. And here's what the new seals look like on the W pipe. You can see the white and the black one. I did coat the black one in a little bit of red grease just to help that maneuver in as it's tightening down so that nothing tears or gets caught or anything like that, and hopefully create a little bit of a better seal. One thing to note before putting the gaskets on and installing your W pipe, I was recommended to spray these with some kind of a copper spray gasket, which I have here. I got this from Permatex, but there's a bunch of other brands that also make this. It's good for high temperatures, and it will just help slightly increase the seal of these paper gaskets for the intake and the W pipe, just to help prevent any kind of leaks or anything like that. Some people have said that they've done just fine without using any kind of spray like this or any kind of gasket. But I'm going to go ahead and do this just to be extra safe and take the extra step to ensure no leaks. Just making sure we have a nice even coat, no spots. So now we have both sides of our gaskets sprayed with the copper gasket, ready to be installed onto the W pipe once this kind of dries a little bit. Just going to place the gaskets here on the W pipe. It's just tacky enough that it's going to stick to the surface, making it easier to stay on as I align the W pipe and bolt it in. Okay, now I have both gaskets aligned on the W pipe. Okay, now we just have to get the W pipe installed. Again, I have my O-rings and spacers in place and my paper gaskets. And I'm going to use my bolts here to kind of get it in place and hold it into position while I get the other bolts in place. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm getting in the good habit of putting NECs on any of the bolts that I'm using. In my specific kit, I happen to get a stainless bolt for the long center bolt, but my shorter bolts on the sides are the usual zinc coated bolts, so I'm using usual aluminum NECs on those. So make sure you're using the right NECs for the right application. I'm just finger tightening these bolts for the moment so that I can get the other bolts in place, and then I'll torque everything towards the end, and that should get everything lined up and in place. All right, next you want to get your W pipe aligned best you can with your throttle assembly here, and try and get that center bolt started on that. Okay, I have that finger tight now, so that is in place. And next I'm going to put in the two bottom bolts that are facing the front here. Those are also those shorter bolts. I can fit my fingers into this space, but you may find it helpful to use a socket just to get these loosely in there. Okay. All 5 bolts are now in place, finger tightened, so that I know that all the threads are aligned and that this is exactly where it needs to be. As I torque these down, that will create the tight seal here. It will also seal up the little gap here as well. Greasing the O-rings ahead of time will allow those to kind of sit in place and slide where they need to go to create that tight seal here as well, so that we don't get any kind of vacuum leaks. Each of these bolts takes an 11mm socket. So I'm just going to take my socket and go through and start to tighten these down. I'm not going to torque them down just yet. I'm just going to get these a little bit tighter than finger tight. And using the extension on this has given me plenty of room to go in and tighten these a little bit further, particularly in this hard to reach spot over here by the AC compressor. as you start to torque down the center bolt, you will see the assembly here kind of start to adjust and maneuver a little bit as that seal starts to close up, like I mentioned. I'm going to do an approximate crisscross pattern by going from this side down to the lower bolt on this side, and to the upper bolt, and then to the lower bolt down below on the other side. Now this bottom one, I can't fit my torque wrench adapter in there, so I'm going to have to do it just by feel, kind of based on these other three that I just did. But again, we don't want to be putting a ton of torque on these. We don't want to be pulling on these as hard as we can or anything like that. Okay. Now last, we will do the center bolts. Now our W pipe is completely installed and torqued down. The next thing we'll need to do is to connect this white connector here. Put that back together. Mine has been marked with an X, so I know exactly which way this needs to come together. But you can see by the way mine is marked, with the connector facing you, you're going to be plugging it into the right side of the connector. And it's going to fit in just like a puzzle piece. Okay, the next component we need to get in place is the idle speed motor with the affectionately called pipe of agony attached. This is going to go right back where it was, into this slot just behind the cold start valve. And the pipe of agony is going to go into our air fuel mixture. If you're not aware, it's called a pipe of agony because of how difficult it is to install. You have limited visibility and you have a lot of components here to kind of shove the pipe through and get it into place. But I'm going to try my best to show you some ways to get a little bit of visibility to help guide this pipe in to make this as easy as possible. But by no means is this job easy. I think those that have gotten it on the first or second tries got very lucky. And even just trying to kind of practice a little bit or trying to get the placement right, I've had some difficulty. But I will do my best to show you where you can look and kind of see where the pipe is going so that you can get this into place. But once you get the pipe installed and in place, then it's just a matter of just bolting down the idle speed motor bracket to the intake and connecting the electrical connector, and that's all it takes. So really the bulk of this is just getting that pipe into place to seal up that hole in the air fuel mixture. All right, one way to give you an idea of where the hole is that you're trying to aim for this pipe is I've placed a light here to the side of the intake. That's going to shine straight through this way. And if I open up our plate here, you can see the light coming through that hole there inside of the air fuel mixture unit. So that's what we're aiming for. The hole is also, you can just see it in the gap down here where you can kind of see that light shining a little bit. That's about where you're trying to go. And so in order to get there, you have to align the pipe to go in between your distributor and this part of the intake. So you're going to be going through this gap in here, trying to reach the hole in the air fuel mixture. So you can kind of see with all of the fuel lines and the spark plug wires and other things here, how that might be a little bit difficult getting some room to align this pipe and kind of get it to where it needs to go. But by looking through the gap here and viewing the hole from the inside here, as you're trying to place the pipe, you can get an idea of where you're going, where you need to end up. One trick that is recommended by a lot of folks is to actually leave a light here on the side and then kind of view the hole on the inside as a guide to place the pipe. So I will be trying that next and seeing how that works for me. One trick that I've also seen that's worked for me just trying to figure this out is putting my light kind of behind the unit so that I can see in the gap down here in between this space, and then I can see if my pipe is reaching the hole or not. And I've been able to use that to kind of generally guide it into place. One thing to note as well, you should have noted earlier if you were disassembling yours, just kind of noting where the fuel lines and kind of which wires and things are tucked into the elbow of this pipe here. So I have a couple of fuel lines here. These two fuel lines were on the inside of this elbow, and it was kind of wrapping around those. So you'll want to place this the way it was before disassembly. That'll make it a lot easier as well to kind of get things into place and to, you know, kind of get things aligned. So every car is a little bit different, but that's how my car was. And so I'm just trying to pay attention to make sure that I have everything organized just the way it was before disassembly. And one of the last things I'm going to do before inserting this in is I greased up the end of the pipe with just a little bit of high temperature grease, just to help that slide into that hole a bit easier. You don't have to go very far. It's only going to go in about an inch or an inch and a half or so. So you don't have to grease up the whole pipe, just the end there to help you get started and get it into place. Okay, you can see this kind of first step as I start working on getting this aligned. I've not inserted the pipe yet, but you can see that I have my two fuel lines kind of on the inside of that elbow. And I have it going into the gap between my distributor and that first kind of column on the intake, or the one that's furthest back. So I have it going into that gap, and I have my idle speed motor about like in place where it's going to end up kind of aligning and getting bolted. So that has me on the right track. I can also see the pipe starting to go through the gap here, so I'm pretty close already from what I can tell in this gap here. So I'm just going to keep using that for sight into where I'm aiming, and hopefully that grease will help me get the pipe snug in there and inserted. Okay, after a few minutes of kind of wrangling around, I was able to get the pipe of agony into place. So this is kind of where my idle speed motor is sitting right now. You can see it's kind of snugged up close to the intake. You can see my fuel lines there in the elbow. And then if we look inside of the unit, you can see the end of the pipe sitting in the hole there. So we know for sure that we've made it there. So the next step is going to be getting the connections into place. For the idle speed motor, I have to get it connected to the side of my cold start valve. This little rubber guy is going to slip on there, and we have to get it bolted to the intake and then this electrical connector put on. Okay, I've got the little rubber hose connected here to the cold start valve. I did put a small hose clamp on here. My car didn't have it originally, but I have seen cars that do. And for me, it's just more of a preventative kind of safety precaution thing to get a hose clamp on here to kind of further reduce chances of any kind of leaks or anything like that. So I've got that connection in place. So next we're just gonna put our cap screws into the bracket here. There's one on each side. So 2 cap screws total, and then we'll do our connector. Now we have our 2 mounting cap screws in the bracket there. I did have to move this right here from below the idle speed motor to kind of just beside it on top of the warm-up regulator, just to give me some room to kind of bend this downward to get that screw into the bracket. But that's what it looks like in place. Next, we're going to tighten down these cap screws using an H5 hex key. I have the T handle style here, so that'll give me plenty of leverage to reach these screws, but then also tighten these down. I don't have a specific torque setting for these, but you don't want to torque them down so much that you break the threads or ruin the bracket or anything. You just want to get it tight enough so that they will keep the idle speed motor in place and keep it from slipping around as the engine is vibrating around. I'm going to first just torque these down just lightly and kind of go back and forth so that they tighten evenly. And once they're pretty close, then I'm going to give them a nice good tug here to tighten those down. To assist with getting the screws in place and getting the idle speed motor in place, I did disconnect the warm-up regulator and cold start valve plugs so that I can move these plugs out of the way and kind of get that harness free. So now that everything is secured down, I can reconnect those connections. So you do your gray to your warm-up regulator and your blue to your cold start valve. And the last one here is going to be the black plug for the idle speed motor. And you can connect it just like that. Now the last piece that we will need to install before starting the car and letting that run is putting our air inlet system in place. I've gotten a start on mine because I have a modification on my car that's different from stock. But essentially, if you have stock or even the same modification, what you're going to want to do is reconnect this elbow here back to the connection through the fiberglass wall here. Make sure that that's connected to the component on the inside. And then you route your elbow or your tube under the coolant line here to the airbox assembly, and then of course your airbox assembly goes on top just like it was. When you do place this on top, you want to make sure that the ring below here fits on top of the inlet of the air fuel mixture assembly or unit. So you can just place that on top just like that. See, everything is in place. And then you'll want to get your bolts back into the 3 bolt holes that are part of the assembly to bolt that to the intake. And then we will also need to connect the hose here to the oil filler neck. Now what I've done is I've run the tube coming from the air filter box in between the idle speed motor and the cold start valve so that I can reach around to the neck on the oil filler neck. So I'm just going to slide that on there. That is pretty simple. And next, all we need to do is put the bolts into the filter assembly, and assembly will be done. Now for my car, I bought these screws here that make assembly and disassembly and removing the airbox much easier than these stock bolts. You don't need any tools, and you can just use your fingers to loosen these. So I'm just going to bolt these in using my fingers. There's no specific torque setting or anything that you need to put these at. They just need to be tight enough to hold the assembly on top of the intake so it won't go flying anywhere. So I'm just going to go ahead and just loosely put these in. Okay, all three bolts are now in place on the air filter assembly. So I'm just going to go around and just tighten these as best I can to keep this in place. Once your air filter assembly is in place, that concludes assembling your engine back together and putting your valley back together. Everything is now in place as it should be. What you want to do next is to go through and just double check any connections around the engine bay. You want to check anything back here that may have gotten knocked loose or disconnected by accident as you were moving around the engine bay, and just do some checks. I've checked mine and everything looks good. Nothing has been knocked loose. So the next step I'm going to take is to do a fuel leak test. Since we did disconnect the fuel lines here, I want to make sure that I don't have any leaks before I start the car and start driving it around. I can shoot a short video for that to show how to jump the RPM relay in order to check for leaks. But as far as getting into the valley and then reassembling the valley, that is every step. And at this point, we are done with assembling the valley back together. Okay, now that we have everything reconnected and reinstalled in our engine bay, we can start to prep the car to start it up and to see if all of our hard work paid off. Now, before diving into your valley, as I showed earlier in the video as well, you should have removed the battery out of the car. So the first thing we have to do is put the battery back in so that we can then give power to the fuel pump for our fuel leak test. Okay, now that we have power to the car, we need to set up for our fuel leak test. So you want to get into your panel here for your relays. This is behind your passenger seat. You can see I have that moved forward. You just lift up the carpet here, and there will be a wood panel that you would just pull out to reveal all of your relays. Now, the main thing that we're going to be focusing on to do our fuel leak test is the RPM relay, which should be located somewhere towards this area. It's a black rectangular relay on its own little harness here. Pretty easy to identify. We're going to be disconnecting this from the connector. Okay, I'm going to separate the relay now, and it's just that simple. Okay, in order to start running our fuel pump, we will need to jump two connectors or two terminals on the connector for the RPM relay. I have made this little jumper. A lot of people have to make these at home. I used a little bit of 14 or 16 gauge wire with two spade connectors. So I made this myself. This will help me jump two terminals on this connector, and I'm going to show you which terminals that is and how to determine if you're jumping the right ones. Okay, so here's how to determine which terminals you need to jump. So looking at the terminal here, notice the little notched corners here on the top right and top left corners on this view. In this orientation, if you kind of bend the connector down and look at it from the top there, you can see a brown wire. And then if I rotate it to see the bottom, you can see that purple and white wire. Those are the two wires that you're going to be jumping to run your fuel pump. That is this terminal right here, the top right, and then the bottom left terminals. So the brown wire and the purple and white striped wire, top right terminal, bottom left terminal, in this orientation. So when you jump those, you're going to hear your fuel pump start running automatically, and that will start to pressurize your system, which then you can start to see if you have any leaks. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and use our jumper and connect those terminals. And as soon as you connect that jumper, you should start hearing your fuel pump whirring or humming slightly, so you just want to listen for that sound. Okay, while the fuel pump is running, now we just want to start inspecting all of our connections, all the fuel lines that we had just reconnected when reassembling our K-Jet unit. You also want to check your fuel injector connections as best you can. You may have to grab a light and just verify that there aren't any leaks there, if there weren't any before, or if you did any work on those. So far, we're looking pretty good. And I don't smell any gas or see any leaks or anything squirting out, so I think we're gonna be okay. Okay, once you are done inspecting your fuel system for any leaks and you verified that there aren't any leaks, or if you found any and you needed to fix some leaks, and you've had to do this process a couple more times, once you're done, all you have to do is just disconnect your jumper, and that will immediately stop the fuel pump from running, and you have just performed a fuel leak test. Next, all we have to do is just replace the RPM relay. Make sure that you line up with the indented corners here with the little notches or the plastic pieces on the RPM relay, so that you are putting it back on in the right orientation. It is pretty hard to put it on the wrong way. I think it's nearly impossible, but there we go. We have our RPM relay reconnected, and the car is just about ready to start. Okay, the last thing we need to do is actually get this car started. Since we just did a fuel pressurize and leak test, it still may take a few tries to get the car started, since the whole system needs to get repressurized and we need to get fuel moving through the system. So I'm just going to fuel the process. I'm not going to guarantee that my car is going to start, because there are a bunch of other things that could go wrong, but today is the ultimate test to see if there's anything else I need to investigate, or if everything is all good. Okay, so the first attempt at starting the car, it wasn't starting. We ended up figuring out that the battery just needed a jump after sitting for a little while during the project. But now the car starts. It took a couple of short tries, but once we got the battery jumped, it starts right up without too many issues now. There we go. That completes doing a valley job and making sure that your car is back up and running again.